Support for this week's episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Diller Teen Tikkun Olam Awards. Applications and nominations are open now. The Diller Teen Tikkun Olam Awards honor up to 15 Jewish teens from across the United States with an award of $36,000 to recognize their impact and leadership to repair the world. Nominate a teen today, or they can apply directly by January 5th. Learn more at dillerteenawards.org. That's DILLER teenawards.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 345, When Jewish Meets Jewitch. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And first of all, we want to wish you a Shana Tova, a Happy New Year. Rosh Hashanah is coming in just a few days, and that means that this is our last episode of the Shemitah year. That's that year that comes every 7 years, and it is a year in which we let the land rest, release debts, and we have spent this whole year thinking about what else it can be all about. And now that year is over. We're talking about what does it mean that that year is over? Maybe better to just think that the next cycle has begun. But in the meantime, we are having a Havdalah ceremony. Havdalah is the ceremony that happens at the end of Shabbat, ushering the Shabbat out and beginning the next week. And we thought it would be fun and interesting to have a special Havdalah ceremony for the Shemitah year. So we are going to be doing that Saturday night. If you're listening to this podcast the day it comes out on Friday, that means tomorrow. Saturday night, September 24th, 2022, at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 4:30 p.m. Pacific Time. It's on Zoom. To register, just go to judaismunbound.com/Elul. That's ELUL. And we really hope you'll be there with us at this experimental Havdalah, bringing out the Shemitah year and bringing in the new cycle on the Jewish calendar. And one other thing about Rosh Hashanah coming up, and those of you who listen to Judaism Unbound know this little piece of information that I'm going to drop on you. If you listened last week, you know it. But basically, it is that Rosh Hashanah is not actually the Jewish New Year according to the Bible. The Jewish New Year according to the Bible starts in the first month in the Bible, which is the month that Passover is in. So the month of Tishrei that Rosh Hashanah is in is actually the 7th month of the year. And what do we know happens in our 7th month of the year, July? For many nonprofit organizations, it's the beginning of their fiscal year. And that is a great opportunity to consider doing what a lot of Jewish organizations are probably asking you to do this time of year, which is to make a donation to help support this work. We would really benefit from your making a small gift. We often suggest just $1 for every hour that you've spent with us in the last year, so that might end up being like $50, maybe $18. If you're able to give more, we invite you and are so grateful for you to give more because a lot of people can't give or won't end up giving or won't remember. Your willingness to make larger gifts, if you can afford to do that, is what allows us to continue to create this content and these learning experiences and these experimental Jewish experiences all throughout the year. So thank you so much for considering a donation. To make one, just go to judaismunbound.com/donate. And now to today's conversation. Our guest today, Ketzirah Lesser, is someone who is out there doing the kind of reimagining of Judaism that we just wish everybody would be doing. Through Devotage Sacred Arts, she creates magical Judaica, art, and ceremonies inspired by the rich depth of Jewish history and traditions. Her work is to explore and create beautiful connections that connect past, present, and possible futures. Ketzirah Lesser is the author of Ruby Red Seeds, a collection of poetry, prayer, and midrash, and from 2008 to 2017, she led live streaming interactive Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, and High Holiday services for One Shul, an online synagogue. Ketzirah Lesser was a member of the first cohort, this was in 2009, to receive ordination as a Kohenet through the Kohenet Hebrew Priestess Institute. We explored Kohenet in episodes 240 and 246 with Jill Hammer, Taya Shir, and Ketzirah Halev Fife, and Ketzirah Halev Fife and Jill Hammer have been amazing teachers in the Yeshiva as well. We are so thrilled to be having this conversation with someone we've admired for a long time. So Ketzirah Lesser, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Great to be here. Appreciate it, both of you.
You know, I think probably to the annoyance of our listeners, I have been struggling for years now trying to articulate this idea of bringing an artist's sensibility and an artist's skill set to Judaism as the raw material for the art. And in many ways, you're a person who I've looked out there and said, yeah, I think that's what she's doing. So I'm excited to have this conversation. And I thought maybe part of the way into it would be just to look at the tagline for your Devotage Sacred Arts, which is Fragments of a Forgotten Future. And I wanted to ask you, what is the connection, as you see it, between the past and the future?
Woo, okay, we're just gonna go huge. Oh, so Fragments of a Forgotten Future. It's interesting because it aligns a lot with things I've heard you and Lex talk about actually, and a few other people. But the way I think about my work writ large in the Jewish community is really about looking forward to the Jewish world that I hope exists and doing what I can as a artisan, a crafter, a maker, to bring artifacts to now. And so what are those artifacts that I can pull from the future into the now so we can start seeing what that might look like, sort of leaving breadcrumbs for the future along the way. One of many inspirations I have is a lot of science fiction writers, and in this case, William Gibson and his saying of the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. The Judaism, the Jewish world, the world that I hope can exist already exists in places. So I'm trying to pull the pieces of it into the now that I can help get into the now to help everybody else, including myself, see what could be.
One possibility that I also struggle to articulate is that in trying to imagine a Jewish future that is different from the Jewish past and present, there must be a certain humility to it where you have to say, I don't know what that's going to look like. I know it's going to look very different from what it looks like now. And when I say things like that, I often get pressure back from people that say, okay, well, describe it to me. And in all honesty, in all, not false humility, real humility, I'm saying like, no, if I tried to describe a future to you, that would be the height of hubris. And I won't do it. I can't do it. And anybody who says that they can do it, it's like the test of a false messiah. Anyone who says they're a messiah is not the messiah. So is what you're saying, though, that maybe the best we can do is to sort of pull forward little snapshots of that future as they come to us, and somehow the more people that are doing that a little bit, maybe the more that future will come into some focus. I mean, that's sort of number one possibility. And number two possibility, what you're talking about with William Gibson, is that, no, it's actually that elements of that future are more than snapshots. They exist in the world today. They're just not recognized as the future. And simply by maybe raising them up and bringing more attention to them, we can start to make that real, that future is going to come from those things.
I'm not going to claim I know what the future looks like, but I do think any of us can have glimpses of a future or have visions of what we might want that to be. And yes, I think the more we enact the future we want, Jewishly or otherwise, the more we realize if it's the future we want, because we don't always know, it seems like a great idea, and you're like, oh, this is terrible. You start to help other people realize what can be. I know both of you are aware of this, but so I, pre-pandemic, led an online synagogue called One Shul, right? I was not the founder of it, but I was the leader of it. And I remember at the time when I would talk about the fact that we did services online, people were like, what? How does one do that? I don't understand. And it was this whole mystery to people. It was, and I'm probably, leading in here, but it was pure witchcraft, right? As far as people are concerned, how do you do this? That's not a thing. You can't honor these various pieces. Why would you do that? Who comes to that kind of thing? Like there's a lot of those pieces. And then I hit a point in my life where I realized I wasn't interested. I used to frame this as being a pulpit priestess. And then somebody recently said, what's a pulpit? And I went, oh, it's a Christian bema. I wasn't interested in being the pastoral rabbi priestess who is leading services and always doing that. I still do a lot of it, but I didn't want it to be the core of what I do. And it wasn't who I was. I was putting myself into a role that I felt like I needed to at the time. So I stepped away from that. And then the organization for One Shul kind of shut down maybe 2 years before the pandemic. And then the next thing I know, we're all doing this online, and I'm back doing services online with Kohenet Community. And so, but there it was, I had a glimpse of that future. And there were a bunch of us who that was something we did and we were comfortable with. And we were able to use the technology in really connective ways and have deep spiritual, meaningful experiences and build community in ways no one thought was possible. And now everyone thinks it's really possible.
Yeah, I'm going to want to talk to you more about what I see as your status as kind of a digital Jewish elder, because I remember when One Shul and Punk Torah were this wild thing where there's Judaism on the internet, kids. Like I remember some of these articles, and I'm like mocking, but I actually think that's basically what the tone of some of these were in like the late first decade of the 2000s. So we'll come back to that. But I want to talk about magic, which is spelled sometimes Magic, and in a lot of your materials, it is spelled Magick. And that's really interesting to me. And I didn't know what to make of that at first, but I did some Googling and found some really interesting things about what magic with a K means. And I want to hear those things come out of your mouth, not mine. But suffice to say, I have a struggle with a lot of Jewish spaces that hear the word magic and their response is like, oh yeah, that's not what we do. There's Judaism on one side. I'm going to use a bunch of words in quotations. Assume everything that follows is in quotations. There's Judaism, which is like real and authentic and sacred and divine. And then there's magic, which is like sorcery. It's like make-believe. It's like somebody on a stage doing illusions. And the idea of illusions is that they're not real. So magic is not what Judaism is. Judaism is the real thing. I kind of can't stand that. And the reason is that I think that philosophy stands in the way of seeking out magical experiences. I only want to set foot in a Jewish space that is striving to be magical. And I sort of mean magical just as like excellent or really amazing, but I also mean it in the sense of like, I want to go to a Jewish space where we think the words we're saying are transforming reality in the same way that a spell does. I'm not interested in doing Havdalah as the ritual separating Shabbat from the rest of the week with a bunch of folks who think we're not doing anything, that we're just sort of like we're holding up a bunch of props, the wine and the candles. And then like, no, I actually want, whether I think there's something metaphysically happening or not, I want to opt in to see those blessings of wine, of spices, of fire, and of the separation of Shabbat and the rest of the week. I actually want the people participating to feel like we are making Shabbat end, and we are making the week that is not Shabbat begin. Because otherwise, like, what are we doing? We're just like playing a game. And I find that there's a lot of spaces that actually seem to want to do the game. They want to do rituals that we've done for a while, but without thinking they're really doing magic work. And I do think magic is the right word because it's polarizing. Like there are people who love thinking of Judaism as magic and people who don't. When you use the word magic frequently in your materials, like what do you mean by it? What does it mean to weave magic as a Jewish educator or teacher or crafter?
So the first thing I'll answer the actual question, but I want to say I believe there should be space for people who are into woo, as it is sometimes called, and folks who aren't. For folks who need to experience it as metaphor, and folks who want to go all in and be like, yes, we are literally changing time space through this, right? And in my understanding, at least, Judaism has, up until very recently, had both in pretty equal balance, right? We have concepts like keva and kavanah, right? You have keva is structure, kavanah is intention. These things are always in balance for amazing Jewish experiences when you're doing them. And up until about the 18th century, you were hard pressed to separate magic and religion. And then we had the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, and we started to really strip away, right? It happened before that too. You have Maimonides, very not into the woo, but there wasn't a difference. And then we suddenly had both the Jewish Enlightenment and sort of the rest of the world, or the Western world Enlightenment, where you had science and then you had superstition, and the constant pull between who is in charge and who's not allowed to do the things that people in charge are allowed to do. And that's also a lot of when something is called magic, it's because, or witchcraft or witch, it's because you're not allowed to do that. So let me answer the question of what do I actually think magic is before I digress wildly on the rest of this.
So just as a clarification, when you say magic is what you're not supposed to be doing, you're saying that the you in that sentence is the people who are not in charge. And they were being told that by the people who are in charge.
Exactly. Okay, so what is magic? The most common definition is by a highly problematic person, but it's actually a really good definition. So the definition a lot of folks know, or may find if they start Googling it, is magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. That's from Aleister Crowley. He is a Victorian era mystic. You'll read lots of things if you look him up. A lot of modern definitions of magic kind of come out from that. And his is reasonably accurate to past tense, more ancient forms of understandings of magic. One of my favorite definitions, though, so before I get to my personal definition, is by Judika Ills, who is a very prolific writer and editor of all things magical. And what she says is that a magic spell is a conscious, formalized attempt to manipulate magic power and energy in order to achieve your personal goal. That doesn't take it into kind of the cosmic connection piece where something like Havdalah is actually impacting what's happening in our world, except for you personally having the end of Shabbat in the beginning of your week. And then years ago, somebody basically asked me, what is my process for making an amulet? And of course, I was like, well, shit, I better be able to explain that coherently, right? Like I was like, ooh. So I had to figure out what's my definition. And I tend to use the term sacred arts. I'll use magic, witchcraft in some instances, but they're words that are highly loaded with people's preconceived notions of what they think I mean. And I find the term sacred arts is just confusing enough that people will actually listen, right? Like they're like, yeah. I don't know what that is. She an artist? Is she painting? Is it this? I'm like, yes, it's all of the above. So my definition that I created around magic using the concept of sacred arts is that the sacred arts are an interdisciplinary practice of creating catalysts for spiritual or material change. And I apply that to almost all forms of, I'll just say magic right now for lack of a better term, but if you're thinking even Havdalah ritual, you're trying to create a spiritual change, a change between sacred time, which is Shabbat, and mundane or everyday time, which is the week. The catalyst is the ritual that you're doing as a community. And because you've done this, and I like Havdalah for this, because it is an interdisciplinary practice, right? You have language being used, you have movement being used, you have song being used, you have ritual objects being used as part of it. There's all of these pieces have to come together to create the experience that, when at its highest potential, I think, actually has a transformative effect on the people involved in the experience.
That totally resonates with me. And I just, to get at what my vision, dream of Jewish present and future, to get at what you were saying before about trying to play our part in creating the futures we believe in, I actually don't care whether people think scientifically or metaphysically Havdalah makes a real thing called Shabbat that we could like distill and quantify end, and another real thing called the week, Shavua in Hebrew, begin. Like it, and I don't even know whether I think that to me, what Judaism is and what practice is, whether it's like deep religious practice or extra religious practice, what that is like you're creating Some might call it an illusion in the magic sense, but like you're opting into a framework, like you're deciding to make it real. And within that, you then can do magic spells. You can do all sorts of things to manipulate a reality that you have opted into, almost independent of whether it is the world, like whether that's what God created. Like for me, do I think God created that Shabbat and that week? Do I think humans created that Shabbat and that week? I would lean more that humans invented the idea of Shabbat. But there's a power in opting in to the transcendent, where I am granting myself a kind of power to alter reality. And I'm using the word alter because it's one of my favorite Jewish words. I have different answers I give for what is Judaism in one character on a keyboard, 7. What is Judaism in one syllable? I say new. In English, in Yiddish, and in Hebrew. Not going to go into that now. If I got 2 syllables, my answer would be alter. I'm thinking of altar in English with an AR at the end, which is like an elevated place, like a bima in Hebrew terminology. And what's funny is in many spots of the Bible, altars are bad. It's this whole thing that you're actually not supposed to make them, but we have bimas everywhere. We just don't call them altars because that sounds like an idolatrous thing or whatever. That's one term, altars. Alter with an ER, also in English, which means change stuff. It's a verb. Altering tradition. That's what Judaism is. It's a constant stream of altering what we've received. But then the third is alter in Yiddish, which is elder or old. And so through these 2 syllables, alter, you get at oldness in one language, you get at newness because it's all about change. And you also get at this elevation, this like placing certain things on a literal pedestal. I do actually want to do that. I'm not somebody who wants to eliminate any of that in religious practice. So I guess since you are connected to multiple versions of that altar word too, and you used it, how does altar tie to your work with devotage and, the crafting that you do in the world?
Yeah. Ooh, I love this. Okay. So altar. I find it linguistically entertaining in a really nerdy way when people misspell in English alter when they mean alter to transform. And their intent, you can tell from the writing, was alter as in an altar, the noun. So it's interesting because a lot of having an altar and talking about having an altar alters the space. Right? When one of the first things we do in Kohenic community when we gather as a community, either in a training week or for a Shabbaton, is we set up the central altar. It transforms whatever space we're in by doing that. I've had fascinating conversations with people who see the altar and have very interesting responses to it, right? Some people I don't understand. What is that? We're like, it's our bima. It's fine. This is our version of a bima, right? I use the most boring words possible for people unless they want more. But I have had people, and it was actually, I'm glad I can't remember her name, pulled me aside and was like, what's with the thing? I was like, the altar? Yeah. And I was trying to immediately determine which way this conversation, how fast was I going to be accused of avodah zarah, false idols, basically, one of the many things if you do non-normative practices, one is accused of on the regular. And I was waiting to see how fast are we going there? Is that not where we're going? It took about 5 minutes. And, asking me things, and I'm trying to explain it. And I'm using the simplest, least woo language because I had a feeling that was the way to go. And I'm explaining the things that are on the altar, why we use it. And, the most obvious thing that's there is a copper wash basin. And that is directly bringing back the wash basin of the priests, the Kohanim. But we also do it, there are crushed mirrors in the bottom of it, because in the Torah, it teaches that the tzovot, the women who served at the gateway, the doorway of the Mishkan, the wilderness tent, the tabernacle, gave their mirrors to the priests to make the wash basin. So as Kohanot, we have reclaimed that. And I think this one time somebody had put down a little carved turtle. And this person, and I knew as soon as the turtle came up, it's like, okay, all right, here we go. We're going for the idolatry moment. All right, let's do it. And the person is talking, was like, it's a turtle. And I was like, we are not worshiping the turtle. I promise you, we're not worshiping the turtle. But it was a thing that somebody had put down. But all of this long way long to get to this altar, the moment we set it up transforms any space for us and transforms what other people know as a synagogue. I don't know why I air quoted verbally and visibly there, air quoted synagogue there, but it transforms the synagogue space for people looking in from the outside into something that they suddenly go, wait, something's happening here we don't understand. There's a lot of Torah time spent on describing the actual altar, which was used for animal sacrifice. We don't do that, let me be clear. But we have the space that holds spiritual energy for us. It holds focus. It reminds us of our stories. It's a central focal point for those who visually can see it, and in good and bad ways, as we've discovered over the years.
How did you get into Avodah Zarah? No, I mean, how did you get into this world of Judaism? Like, what's the process? Because I imagine some of our listeners are listening to this and saying, yeah, that actually sounds like something that I would be. I mean, I'm sure there's some that are having the other, and I want to have the conversation about them later. But now I'm sort of thinking about, people that are listening to this, and this kind of conversation didn't exist however many years ago you began on this path, that you could sort of find this on the internet. So how did you make this journey to this approach to Judaism?
Over the 20th century, and I'm sure this happened prior, but my ability to observe this pattern is limited to either my lifespan or what I've seen documented. In the 1950s and 60s, American Jews who were disaffected with Judaism suddenly became Buddhists. We had a lot of Jew-boos suddenly appearing on the scene, right? That came into people's consciousness, and suddenly that was a thing, right? We suddenly had yoga land in the United States, and Hindu spirituality, sometimes horrifyingly appropriated, sometimes actually full spectrum coming in. And what people felt they didn't have in Jewish teachings, a lot of folks were like, this solves what I'm missing. Then you have the 80s, the 90s. So I'm Gen X. So that's my majorly formative years, right? That was the era where, bad quote of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but everyone with a henna tattoo thinks she's a sister to the Dark One, right? Everyone suddenly became Wiccan. The books became, we didn't have the internet, but we had books that became available. And due to incorporation of Christian and then neo-pagan Western occultist Kabbalah and or horrifying appropriation of those things into Western occult and paganism, Jewish folks, many like me, would look at it and go, wait, they're using Hebrew prayers? This is weird, but okay, what's up? I found that, at least at first, Wicca offered me a direct connection I was lacking in the way I was raised Jewishly. I had a bat mitzvah, barely practicing family in many ways, no woo, and I was definitely a kid who was into woo. And like a lot of folks, the first book I really read in the early, let's say mid-90s, was a book by an author and teacher named Starhawk, who happens to be of Jewish lineage. At the time, she was not claiming that particularly. She was very focused on being one of the creators of what's called Reclaiming Wicca. And I read her book. I was like, this is amazing. And then the whispers would happen with some of your friends. And they're like, oh my God, I have that book too. One of the first things that Starhawk teaches you in one of her books is basically, it doesn't matter why. You do a spell. You have a job interview coming up. You're nervous about your job interview. You do a spell to help you get that job. You walk into that interview, you crush the interview, you get the job. Does it matter if it was just a bit of a psychological thing or if woo happened? Who cares, right? These things can then be abused. And I am a full believer that all spiritual practices, regardless of how beautiful they seem, have been and can be and will be used to abuse and oppress. But that was sort of the very beginning. Was I'm reading Starhawk's books. And this was early web days. So that shift from internet to web was the mid 90s, early 90s there. And there were a couple of active covens in the area that I lived in. Yes, they're actually called covens. And I tried to figure out where these people are and could I go play with them? I did find them, and some of these folks are still my very dearest friends in the world. I defy anyone who says you can't make real relationships online. And I met up with this group of folks, and I joined this old message board back in the message board days called House of Chatter. And a group of them had a what they called a magical working group, and they did public ritual. So I went. And after about a year, they actually asked me to be a member of the group. And then not long after, I was like, so I have a problem. These Anglo-Celtic gods don't talk to me. And very lovingly, my dear friends, my family pushed me back towards Judaism. We're like, don't you have some ancient mystical tradition that you can freaking study? And so I did. And they gently pushed me back in. And at the very first DC Pagan Pride Day that my best friend actually organized, part of how our group worked is everybody invoked deity in their own way. So I got up and I did the Shehechianu, the Jewish prayer for firsts, did it in Hebrew, did it in English. And afterwards, a bunch of folks came over to me and said, do you know what that was? Because everybody was used to Hebrew being used terribly, or like bastardized versions of Jewish prayers being used in magical spaces. And I was like, yeah, I'm Jewish. And they're like, wait, what? And it turned into a whole thing. And then I met like all the Jewitches started to come out of the woodwork. So I started blogging because I was trying to find other people. And so it started to connect me. And there were a couple of Yahoo listservs, Yahoo group listservs back in the day. There was a Jewitches one run by this amazing woman, Melissa Mears. I'm not even sure that's her last name anymore. And she connected a lot of us. And then there were a couple of others that bring you all the way up to today with Jewitches.com. And really introducing a shockingly large number. I'm amazed at the following because I didn't know there were this many people into it. And now you have folks, and I will claim the elder. I am close to 50.
You're an altar.
I'm an altar. Younger folks now don't go through the pagan community necessarily the way we all kind of had to. It was really the only route for us, unless you were Orthodox or Chabadnik, right? Where like this mysticism was all there. And it was hiding in the background that was not for the rest of us to see. They have each other for support. So it's really interesting the difference now too, like my relationship with the pagan community, I've discovered is very different than a lot of younger folks, magical Jews. They offered me things I couldn't get in any other way at the time.
First off, whenever the word coven comes up, I like to remind people that like if you ask people, not us, but some people, what Judaism boils down to, they start with the word coven because they say covenant. And there's actually a linguistic relationship between the word for coven that we see as this like insular, witchy, bad, so whatever thing, and covenant, which it's a perfect example of how when something is ours, we just see it as like religion. But when something is external to us, we call it magic or sorcery or something bad until folks like you reclaim those words and show us that they're great. So in the wake of my Havdalah thing before, I was thinking through in my head how much of Jewish tradition really, like, not as a joke, if you described it to somebody who had never seen it before, they would say, oh, it's like a magic thing. Like, if I were to say, like, two people walk into a room, they say some words to each other, they exchange circular objects that go on their finger, they walk in 7 circles, and then they're married. What? Why? Because you said a bunch of spells and did a bunch, and like you hold your hands up in a formulation that looks like Star Trek. I mean, obviously it predates Star Trek, but like, and you convey certain forms of protection on loved ones. And it, by the way, if you're going to say, oh, you don't really think it's like historically, people absolutely thought that many of our blessings brought literal forms of protection. Mezuzahs that people love to say, oh, they're not really amulets. They're not for protection. No, they're on our doorposts at the front of our house because people thought that they actually bring divine protection. It's all magic spells. I can say a word, not only can I, by Jewish law, I'm required to say a phrase before eating anything that transforms a food from forbidden to permitted. That's magic. That's a spell. And so, but I'm curious to break down like how we do that and how our rituals work. And I know you've thought about that. So like when you're putting together rituals, whether it's a 1-sentence spell that you're casting, like you said, to prepare for a job interview, or a much bigger extended event that you're trying to achieve some kind of collective goal for a group of people, like What are the pieces that go into that? How do you actually craft the witchcraft? Like, how do you craft it?
So my training, let me say it that way, my training in ritual craft comes, I would say, equal parts from the Jewish world and actually from the technology of modern neo-pagan approaches to things like ritual. If I look at a breakdown of a Shabbat service or a Shacharit, a morning service, right? There is a clear arc to it that follows very similar to the way I would break out any other ritual I'm doing. So step one in any of these to me is intention. That is the most important thing. Your kavanah in Hebrew, if you want to use that, right? But really being clear on the intention of what you're up to. If I happen to be leading or organizing Friday night services or morning or whatever it is, I try to think about exactly what the transformative experience of that service is about. Even if I never share it with anyone else, why are we there other than it's morning and you do prayers in the morning, or it's Friday night? Like, why? Why are we really there as an organizing principle? It also magically is important because I'm sure we've all read the fairy tales where with 3 wishes that go horribly wrong. First the intention, and then you get to the words. And so thinking through carefully, what is the intention? And then after intention is, what is the myth, the story? Judaism, most faith traditions, right? We are grounded in our stories and they really tell us who we are. We don't tend to call it myth in Judaism, but like Agadah, it's myth. They are the stories, the sacred stories that help define us. And I am as liable to use science fiction as I am Torah. Like I have no shame actually about that. And then what is the thing that is bigger than you that you can wrap around what's about to happen? Because that also then leads you into what are the important symbols? Magic, ritual, religion, we have a lot of encoding of what's happening in the symbol. Sometimes it's a word that is the symbol. I mean, we could spend an hour just talking about the symbolism of the Torah. Like that's a magic trick. We took the destroyed temple, put it in a little portable form, dress it in beautiful clothing, dance around it, and like put all the gorgeous things on top of it, including the breastplate of the priests, right? Like we have done an amazing magic trick with that by encoding the entire history, everything, and peopledom into this amazing portable scrolls. So you figure out your symbols and what those are. They could be colors, they could be objects, and building that through line from intention to story, myth, agadah, into your symbols, and then finally to action. It's way more fun to start with the cool ritual tech you want to do and be like, I have a great idea. We're going to light some shit on fire, and then we're going to dance around it 7 times. I don't know why, but it's going to be awesome. Right? Like I've had many rituals where they actually do start there and we're like, okay, hold on, let's back up. So ideally you're starting with like the intent and then you're letting all that guide you into what are the actions that need to happen. And that can be, I do like to light things on fire. So it can be actually burning things. It can also be the songs you need to use. And you always go back to that kavanah. And then very logistical things like, and these days it's really common, am I doing this on Zoom? Is this public Zoom? Is it other people? Are we in a public park? Am I allowed to burn things there? Can I have wine there? Okay, no wine, okay. So it then gets down into just very theoretically boring, mundane things, but they're also very practical that you work in along the way.
I want to pick up on what you were talking about earlier, also about the idea that, of kind of Jews that go out and have experiences elsewhere. I think on the podcast, we've talked about the analogy to the Amish Rumspringa, the idea that people leave the community for a number of years and then some of them come back and some of them don't. But the ones who do, one imagines that they are bringing something back from that experience, even if the something back that they're bringing is a new devotion to the old stuff that they had left. But I want to look more broadly at this question of how do you come back to Jewish space with these kinds of experiences and say, like, as you were describing some of this stuff, and I think about myself, like, why am I kind of more attracted to the world of the Kohenet world, or these kind of worlds where I'm really a kind of heady person who doesn't really buy into the, elevated plane of this stuff that it's right. I mean, for me, it's all metaphor, but yet I'm somehow drawn to these newer expressions of it much more than the older ones. And part of me feels like it's as if there was a really cool magic trick or magic experience, and people thought this was so cool, I want to do it every single day. And if you start to do it every single day, it starts to get boring. You start to figure out the trick. It doesn't feel like magic anymore. And there's a piece of me that feels like with mainstream Judaism, we've kind of got stuck in that situation, and that maybe it would be better if we practiced Judaism a little less often, right? Rather than 3 times a day, it would only be once a week or something along those lines.
The Allen Iverson philosophy for the sports fans in the house: practice a little less. If you don't get it, that's fine, but keep going.
Nice. I do get it. But so there's that question, but also I guess I wanted to shift it also a little bit into this world that I know you're also active in, which is the creation of new objects of sacred arts, as we might say. But, you have all kinds of things like divination, decks of cards, and golem talismans, so I don't even know the words for all this, but I would love for you to be able to talk about how all of that fits together. And again, maybe a little bit of the glimpse of that potential future that some of these things that you're actually actively involved in the creation of might be pointing to.
So it's interesting. I think it could be, as you said, there's a bit of doing it by rote, right? Like that's sort of how I describe like the Judaism of my childhood. Was a lot. I mean, quite literally was taught to read Hebrew phonetically. What things meant were literally not part of the conversation. And I still remember I must have been either just like right before my bat mitzvah. I was in the choir, and we were doing a song in English. And it was, my little 12-year-old brain was like, oh, these like spiritually beautiful words. Like I was able to process, like, this is really beautiful. And I remember saying that to my cantor and saying, like, what is this? This is really beautiful. And the shock and horror on his face, because it was an English translation of the V'ahavta. And I had no idea. The whole thing was to learn by the 3rd grade to be able to recite the V'ahavta, because at least in my synagogue as a kid, in the 3rd grade was when in Hebrew school, because we had Saturday Hebrew school, you went upstairs to the synagogue. They paraded all the 3rd graders up for the first time because it's the only way people went to Shabbat services. And so that was the whole thing, was like learn to pronounce things correctly. And there was nothing around it. So there's that piece of it, right? There's also the general modern discomfort with actual spiritual experience. And a lot of that comes out of, honestly, like Protestant America, and especially in like the early 1900s and into like the 1950s. At least my understanding is like Jewish people did a lot to make sure we looked Protestant. And I think one of the reasons for, I'm going to say many of us, clearly not all, us being Jewish folks, that we feel like the magic has been lost from the inherited forms that we've been given. Some would call that tradition. Every time I say tradition, I hear my dear friend, Kohenet Shemira Bechira, Sarah Chandler, saying, what is tradition? And it's Reb Zalman, I think, says like, it's what we leave behind for the next generation and for ourselves, so they don't have to start from scratch. But it's all those inherited forms. They are loaded with worldviews we don't have anymore. We're suddenly into monarchy in this country, apparently. Around like the America's current obsession, at least as of this moment in time, with the death of Queen Elizabeth. But in theory, we don't want a king. We don't think a king is a good idea. Yet our frame for God, the divine, in our inherited texts is king. That doesn't work for me at all, right? This is where like I landed in the renewal world first, where I'm like, ooh, ruach, okay, spirit. Yes, I can do that. Like instead of saying melech, king in my prayers, ruach, cool, spirit. And we live in a world now, which we have things like the internet. We have things that a generation or two back, if you describe them, not even just like Lex trying to describe like a wedding ceremony, right? Pure sorcery. Think about trying to explain the internet. Even Star Trek couldn't get this. I'm rewatching Deep Space Nine right now. They got a lot of interesting tech things right. They couldn't imagine a world where the little box everybody carried could have information flown through the air. If you watch Star Trek Next Generation and DS9, they're constantly handing each other the pads. And they walk in a room with 5 of them. Oh, here's the one you need, right? Like they can't even imagine that as an existence. That's sorcery. And there is what has won in a lot of Jewish discourse, I've had it yelled at me many times, and politely questioned, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. So there's all of those pieces. So I'll also say, I think magic is a thing you're allowed to believe in when you're a kid, right? Fantasy stories, and the idea that a fantasy story doesn't just inspire you as an adult, but that you take it as Torah. I find a lot of folks have a deep need to separate Torah from the fantasy novel. And yes, for everybody, I did take Lex's This is Torah too. Like I had a great deal of fun in that class. And so I put a little bit of separation between them, but I chant Octavia Butler passages to the tune of Aleinu at Kohenet services, right? This is a thing I do. So like the Talmud is chock full of miracle workers and wonder workers who were rabbis, the great sages. They studied and practiced witchcraft. It was acceptable for them to do because according to the Talmud, they were battling evil female witches, and they were always women. So it was always in the Talmud, the split between acceptable practices for these, quote, holy men to be doing, and any of the women who did the same thing, with a couple exceptions, were evil, bad, and had to be stopped. So that's a little bit of that, and do look into all the magic in the Talmud because it's really fun.
Yeah, that's what's so amazing. So much of this boils down to translation, right? Like you mentioned words like miracles, wonders. We have these code words where like miracle, wonder, like, so you hold a stick over a body of water and then the water's part, like, okay, fine. Call that a miracle. Call that a wonder. Those are like kosher terms for stuff that God does or that Moses does. Spoiler alert, I think in the Torah, Moses is actually doing a lot more than we think. We like to say that it's God doing it through Moses. I think Moses is kind of a super powered force in the Torah. It's so much of its translation that when we do a thing, we call it a miracle, a wonder, a something that is a more rational term for magic. And then when other people do it, it's just magic, it's sorcery, whatever. Anyway, so I really want to zoom in on objects, physical objects. You make them, and they're very cool, and you can plug them. We'll put them in the show notes, etc. But that's not why I'm asking. Like way at the beginning of this podcast, our second guest ever was Vanessa Oakes, and I know she's influenced you, and I know she's influenced us. She, from my perspective, I mean, she's my Rebbe. She's like my teacher of objects. And what I mean by that is she, in her book, Inventing Jewish Ritual, she really, in a way that some other scholars have done too, but in a way that I find so effective, she hones in on why objects matter to us and why they're not trivial. And she looks in depth at the objects people hold dear and things that tie to their family and things that tie to memories in their life and all sorts of objects. And also just like, to use a word Dan used before, talismans, like whatever we want to call various objects. There's this weird contradiction I think we walk around with, both Jewishly and society-wide, where anything that you can't touch or see is not real. Things have to be material. But then, if you like material objects too much, that's a problem. Like if you like actual objects a whole lot and ascribe real meaning to them, that's also, you've shown that you're like not having acceptable behavior. And so, look, part of this and part of why I'm getting passionate is because I am somebody who believes that it is important for us to recognize that we human beings are not that different from other forms of matter, animals, objects. I think there is less different about us from those things than we like to believe. And I think that when we realize that, we act better and differently in the world. But I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the power of things, objects. Why, in addition to ideas and intentions, which you talked so beautifully about before, that other step of symbols, of like having actual tangible objects that help to represent various ideas, intentions, why does it matter for us to have those? What are the kinds of objects you make? Like, talk to us.
I love it. And what's interesting, actually, what's really interesting on that is both the study, Jewish magic and magic as a legitimate academic course of study, and material religion as an academic course of study. Neither of them were seen as terribly legitimate until the last 10 years or so. The study of the objects themselves, and then the study of magic as a legitimate thing to study from an academic perspective. In a way, I think you said it is, there's one thing to have an experience, but we all like to have the thing we take home. There is a lot of time spent in the Torah describing the objects, the Mishkan, right?
The tabernacle that gets a ton of chapters devoted to its construction in the book of Exodus.
There is a lot of time here. Moses gets so much attention there, but there's also Bezalel, the sacred crafter, who is also given, as it's written in the Torah, a direct download from the divine with the blueprints of the of the Mishkan in the wilderness, right? The menorah, which possibly is a sage bush or is almond blossoms, right? The way the cups look. There's such detail. And I think it, in some ways, goes back into that idea we talked about a bit earlier of how an altar alters the space. The choices of the material things we do, you could put nothing. You could put a single set of candlesticks, right? And they can have incredible power. And within Jewish culture writ large, we have the idea of hidur mitzvah, which is if you're going to make a ritual object, make it as beautiful as you can. Having them be beautiful and evocative, and to each of us, right? There's different styles, so one might not work. So it needs to be one that works for you. And at the beginning of the pandemic, like a lot of folks, I was very frightened. I didn't know what to do. I was searching for something that would help me just feel brave. And I tried to think of what is a symbol, what is a Jewish symbol, what is something we turn to, and it's the golem. Because in times of plague, Jews were often blamed, right? So like there's often a connection between these pieces. But I started by drawing one, and I crafted out of a little bit of felt my first golem and said, if anybody else needs to feel a little bit brave here, here's a golem, here's my understanding, like there's lots of lore around this. Here's the text I use in the scroll that I actually do put inside. I wrote a ritual to empower, to like activate my golem. And then because I have learned from stories, I wrote a ritual to deactivate my golem. I wanted that handy just in case. And it turned out that what a lot of people seem to need were adorable felt golem that they could hug. And then they turned into stickers and glitter golem. Who knew the world needed glitter golem, but apparently we do. And so for me, a lot of the objects I've created are very reverential and irreverent at the same time. Things that if you wanted to simply be an art doll, a little stuffed cute doll, great. It's a little stuffed cute doll. You can just say that's all it is. I'm not offended. If you believe in the magic that I'm putting out there and you want to go through the ritual and you want to have your friend and you want to know that you're now connected to a network of people, even though you'll never meet them, who all have these golem that have been crafted through my hands that are interconnected, amazing, let's do it. For me, at least, crafting of ritual object, magic objects, even the rituals themselves, a lot of it has to do with a sense of personal autonomy and power. And there is a reason that right now in our history and in our time, more people are open to this. We feel uncertain collectively. The world is sort of shaking under our feet in a lot, literally in some ways. And we're looking for things that help us have some sense of control, even if we know we're not going to stop climate change by doing a ritual. That's at least where a lot of that work is for me. And the Netivot Wisdom Oracle, which is the Oracle deck that I created, is one of the most channeled things I've ever created. The Kabbalistic tree of life, the Sphirot, is just an accepted thing in an awful lot of the Jewish world and even the pagan world. It's just a thing. It exists. Of course it's there. And to me, the Netivot, the pathways of the divine that are through Kohenet teachings, are as, if not more powerful into the future. And this to me is a way of bringing them into tangible working form for people and to create a modern, earth-based, Jewish, feminist, queer, embracing all the things, Jewish alternative to the Rider-Waite or the Smith-Waite tarot, whatever way you like to call it.
If you're not familiar with those terms, Rider-Waite and Smith-Waite, that's referring to tarot decks, and Ketzirah is talking about a Jewish alternative to those.
It's a form, it exists, it has a lot of power. It doesn't have to be the only one we all turn to, though. So creating a structure, an opportunity, an approach that is rooted in Judaism and Jewishness that people can turn to.
And on this question, I mean, just in terms of what you're talking about, like I've heard you allude to something before, and I think that I know the answer. This is a kind of question because I almost feel like it's as if we were interviewing a magician and I was going to ask how the trick is done. But I think the way that I'm listening to what you're saying is, to what extent do people have to have the same belief or the same kavanah, the same intentions? Or is there a way that when things truly have a certain kind of power to them, they can be experienced as powerful by people that have a range of ways of relating to that power? In other words, what I'm saying is, like, some people might believe that this deck of cards is actually in touch with some kind of power that is out there that is revealing to them a certain forecast about what they should do. Other people, like me, I guess, would be like, I don't really believe that, but I really like the experience of doing this activity, right? This is working for me on a kind of emotional, psychological level. I'm feeling a certain kind of power. I'm feeling power, even though I don't really believe that the power is there, in a way that I have never felt in the synagogue. So the question becomes, to me, I think, as we explore these kind of vehicles to access something, how do you think about the fact that people are experiencing it in different ways? And I suppose that's kind of the question, too, for that rabbinical student that you were talking about that comes and says, are you worshiping the turtle? It's like, well, some people might be worshiping the turtle, but so what if they are? I'm not. And I fear, I guess, that in kind of contemporary mainstream Judaism, there is an expectation that everybody ought to be doing this for the same reason, having the same set of beliefs. And as a result, a lot of people say, well, I don't really connect with this, so I'm out.
I have absolutely no problem with that sort of messiness, if you will. One of my favorite things, and sort of a way of symbolizing this, is if I'm leading services, if I'm leading the Shema, Shema Yisrael, Shekhinah Eloheinu, Shekhinah Echad, or Adonai Eloheinu, if you prefer, I actually invite people to think about what the name of the divine they're saying their Shema to. Because Adonai is a code, it's an encapsulation. It means a thing that I don't think many of us actually align with, which is my Lord, right, in a monarchic way. And so I invite people to think about, like, what is the name that is yours between you and the divine? Like, what is yours? And if it's Adonai because that's your jam or your comfort zone, fine. Like, that is great. And I then love to hear, and it's very disconcerting to a lot of people because you're used to it being in perfect unison, right? Like, when you do these prayers aloud, everyone's exactly together. You don't ever get out of pace, like you always go, at least in sort of reform kind of worlds. It's and others, it's at your own. But when you say the Shema, it's all in unison. And then you say it and you get to Shema Yisrael. And you can see the people who love this because they proudly shout that name, whatever theirs is, and they don't hesitate. And then you get to the second time, and hopefully the folks who are a little hesitant the first time, and they're like, you know what? Yeah, I can just say the name that works for me right now. And oh my goodness, the world didn't come to an end and Judaism didn't come to an end because we just said the Shema and said, listen, Yisrael, everyone in this room and everywhere else, the divine, by all its many names and complexity, is one. And then we did it, like we did the thing too. So the reason I start with kavanah, intention, at the beginning of a ritual, and I'll say it, is I want to be clear what my intention as the leader or creator of this was. And then I know everyone's going to have their own anyway, because everyone's going to show up at their own and they're going to have their own experience. But at least they know what the intent is. And then you have your own experience as part of it. And I've had people have radically wild, different experiences. And it goes with the golem. I know people are like, oh, it's just adorable. I love it. It's on my little collection with other things I collect. I'm like, fantastic. I love that it's sitting next to your like pop Funko of like the Scarlet Witch. Great. Like, have at it. Or, and, you know, mine is sitting next to, I've got it sitting next to like stuffed animals that are from memes, you know, like I hope nobody allows themselves to be stopped in exploring some of these practices if they're drawn to them, because they're not, quote, into woo. If you're drawn to it, you're drawn to something. So try it out. Giving yourself something that helps you feel centered, feel grounded, feel empowered through the ritual technology, and possibly then connects you to the group ritual technology in a better way. You might realize, she hid this symbol in her deck. I didn't know that's what we were doing in that prayer. Wait, what? The Amidah is a series of incantations. I need to learn more about this now. Like, so for me, anything that helps you key into your own spirituality, that grounds you and connects you to yourself, divine as you understand it, like it's your version, not mine, community, your Jewishness, whatever that is, all of that I have a giant yes, please to.
Thank you so much, Ketzirah Lesser, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure to be on this side of the podcast.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. A reminder that, as Dan mentioned at the top, we've got our Shemitah Havdalah event that is occurring on Saturday, September 24th, which is the day after this podcast is being released. So apologies if you're listening after that, but that is an exciting event that we hope that you'll register for at judaismunbound.com/Elul. You can find the link there. We want to close out this episode by encouraging you to be in touch with us, because we love hearing your questions, your thoughts, and you can send us notes via dan@judaismunbound.com or alex@judaismunbound.com. You can head to our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram accounts at JudaismUnbound for all our handles. And you can head to our website, judaismunbound.com, to explore more of our resources. We also, of course, greatly appreciate it when you're able to financially support us, which you can do on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift via judaismunbound.com/donate. And one final note, which is that support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.